St Valery-en-Caux is an idyllic fishing port on the Normandy coast. It was the site of a bloody battle that would eventually see more than 10,000 British soldiers, largely from the 51st Highland Division, captured. Those who survived the battle would be forced to march east to prisoner of war camps in Eastern Europe, where they would spend the remainder of the war in brutal conditions.
In 1939, as war, certainly impending war, was on the horizon, the decision was taken to double the size of the territorial army. Throughout the country, the recruiting parties went out to get more and more volunteers. There was no shortage of them. And in the Highlands, very quickly, we ended up with sufficient to form not one, but two divisions. They were the 51st Highland Division and the 9th Scottish Division. These divisions, you need to understand, each division is about 20,000 men strong. It's a huge organisation, and it comes with all its integral support, everything from transport and artillery to communications. But the bulk of the division is made up of infantry battalions. There were 9 of these, drawn from the Seaforth Highlanders, the Cameron Highlanders, the Gordon Highlanders, the Garnet Southern Highlanders, and the Black Watch. Together they comprise about 9,000 men. So who were the other 11,000? Well, they were the gunners, the Royal Artillery, that is. There were the signals, the engineers, the medics, the supply forces, the reconnaissance forces, in fact, everything you would need to make this organisation a complete entity capable of sustaining itself for about 48 hours in battle. At the start of 1940, the division, the 51st Highland Division, leaving the 9th behind, was sent to join the British Expeditionary Force in France. In fact, it didn't spend very much time with the British Expeditionary Force. It was sent under command of the French down to the Maginot Line, hundreds of miles away on the Saar. It's therefore not surprising that the division knew nothing of what was going on with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force. In fact, as the division was being given orders to withdraw from the Maginot Line on the 20th of May by road and rail, the rest of the British Expeditionary Force was being outflanked and encircled by Rommel and the rest of the German army, and it would end up on the beaches of Dunkirk. What happened as Dunkirk was going on to the 51st Highland Division was that they went back through France to the west, and they formed a line roughly 20 miles behind the River Somme, and they were in command or under command of the French. They were supporting the French, and a very important part of that support. They formed a line, briefly speaking, from the English Channel for about 25 miles.
I'm John Lowe, and I'm introducing my father, Jack Lowe. Jack Lowe was a Lance Corporal in the Queensland Cameron Highlanders and captured at St Valery. My dad was, he was a big man. He was about 6'2". My memories of him he was always an incredibly gentle man, a very caring man, a very positive man, and very, very hard working. But the biggest thing was always a sense of humour. The laughs and fun we had was just amazing, and that translated into his behaviour with his grandchildren as well. I knew very, very little. I knew he'd been captured at St Valery. I knew he'd been repatriated, and that's how he met my mum. She was the Red Cross nurse, one of the nurses that looked after him. But other than that, he just didn't talk about it much at all, and I think that was pretty similar for most of these people. But after our kids were born, they spent a lot of time with their grandparents just because the 4 of them all loved each other. The 2 boys loved going to their grandparents. And at one point we were talking about things, and I said to my dad, look, I've got your cassette player and cassette tapes. How about you talk and record your story? He said, well, yeah, just for the grandchildren. And at that time, he was really a carer for my mum. So at night time, quite often he would put my mum to bed, and then he sat and talked into the cassette tapes. But it was a whole story from the age of 19, from 1919, right up to the mid-1960s we've got. But that's how we've got his story. He had never been more than about 20 odd miles from his home in his life. He had left school at 14, and he ended up joining the Camerons, getting trained there, and then eventually headed over to France. Well, most of the detail, other than the fact I knew he'd been in the forces, he'd served, like so many others of that generation, I really didn't know much about it until he'd actually passed away in 2004. And we got the cassette tapes, and I started listening to them, and then I turned them all into digital as well. And it was just absolutely fascinating, and particularly the war years. A lot of the rest of the story is really interesting as well, but the war years, some of the things he talked about and what these men went through, it really, really makes you cry.
They called it St Valery, June the 12th, 1940. We had been on the run from the square-headed Hun for just over a month or more. Against 40 divisions, a handful of men were at last driven down to the shore. Our organisation had gone to the dogs. Of food and munitions we had none. But we'll fight on, we said, till the last man is dead and the last round of ammo is done. The French had surrendered and exposed our flanks. There was only the sea at our backs, but with Jerry all round, we still stood our ground, though hundreds were killed in their tracks. Through the long weary night, we still held the town, but the Hun held the heights on our flanks. We tried hard to dislodge him time and again, but a rifle's no use against tanks. They had promised us ships to take us home if we held up the Jerry's attack, but no ships saw we as we gazed out to sea, for the Navy had been ordered back. And through the night some fought and some died, while others just lay down and slept. By dawn's early light came as tragic a sight that even the strongest man wept. Over the blackened ruins waved a white flag. An officer pointed it out. But to hell with the flag, fight on was the cry. Just then the bugle rang out. Ceasefire was the call our straining ears heard. We knew that the fighting was done. Battered and beaten, we had fought to the end, but the battle had gone to the Hun. Now we are in prison, surrounded with wire, and if sometimes we get a bit blue, we don't lose faith in the ultimate end. For what we have done, others can do. If Jerry should strive for 100 more years, the back of proud Britain to bend, just remember what Britons have done in the past, and you know we'll win in the end. Hats off to Britain, to hell with the rest. To beat us, they'll have to be clever. Though they come in their millions with, we'll give them our best, so Britain and freedom forever.
I love you, Dad.
On the 4th of June, by which time the last of the British Expeditionary Force had been evacuated from Dunkirk, the 51st Highland Division were thrown into battle along with the French army in the attempt to defeat the Germans who had established a bridgehead across the Somme in Abbeville. Regrettably, the exercise was a failure, and from then on, the 51st Highland Division and the French would be going west and backwards. On the 5th, there were serious battles as the Germans, hugely superior in numbers to both the 51st Highland Division and the French, forced their way through the lines, causing many casualties. From then on, it was backward movement, but the 51st Highland Division had to move at the speed of the French. By the night of the 9th of June, it was quite clear that the escape routes which had been planned across the River Seine to get the division away were being blocked. Rommel had moved too fast and was already on the bridges. General Victor Fortune, the general commanding division, therefore took the decision to send a brigade called Arc Force, named after the place where it was formed, on the 9th of June, to Le Havre to secure that harbour for evacuation. That force barely escaped before Rommel cut them off. From then on, the 51st Highland Division was forced back into a pocket around the lovely little fishing village of St Valery. Fighting doggedly, tired and weary soldiers, short of ammunition and with no adequate anti-tank weapons, they found themselves on the 11th in fierce battle. Over 80 tanks of Rommel's force broke through the lines from the west, outflanking them. Attempts were being made to put together a fleet, something over 200 ships, similar to Dunkirk, to evacuate them. But a combination of thick fog and the fact that artillery, German artillery, was already on the cliffs, prevented evacuation.
What an incredible story, and just one of many that's being shared as part of the St Valery commemorations. You can read more of these at the St Valery section of the Public Scotland website. Now, in a moment, we're delighted to have a welcome message from Jean-Francois Ouvray, Mayor of St Valery.
Mesdames, Messieurs, chers amis écossais, Monsieur le maire d'Inverness, notre ville jumelle, Mesdames, Messieurs les représentants de la 51e Highland Division et de l'armée, bonjour. Par ces quelques mots, je voudrais vous dire ô combien nous, ici en France, ici à Saint-Valery-en-Caux, nous tenons à la fraternité franco-écossaise et à ces journées du souvenir. Je me présente, je suis Jean-François Ouvray, le nouveau maire de Saint-Valery-en-Caux, récemment élu. À cet instant, je suis accompagné des maires adjoints, des deux présidents d'associations qui travaillent sur l'histoire de notre commune et de Madame Elisabeth Blosville, qui est la garante du drapeau des Highland Reserve Force and Cadet Association. Nous sommes ici, sur les hautes falaises de Saint-Valery-en-Caux, devant ce monument de granit extrait à Balmoral, chez vous. Il fut inauguré en juin 1950 par le général Wimberley, commandant de la division des Highlanders, et par le maire de l'époque. Pour nous, Valriquais, ce monument symbolise le repos éternel des valeureux soldats écossais. Il a été érigé à la mémoire de ces glorieux officiers, sous-officiers et soldats de la 51e division pour ne jamais oublier. Jamais oublier. Chaque année, nous venons nous y recueillir et nous commémorons le courage et l'abnégation de ces soldats qui se sont battus pour notre liberté. Comme le disait notre président de la République, Charles de Gaulle, dans son discours prononcé à Édimbourg en 1942, entre nos deux pays, c'est une histoire de cœur. L'alliance franco-écossaise est la plus vieille alliance du monde. Cette phrase est gravée sur la plaque commémorative à Édimbourg. Saint-Valery est et restera très attachée et très reconnaissante à l'ensemble de la nation écossaise. Et cet attachement s'est concrétisé par notre jumelage avec la ville d'Inverness, pays des Highlanders. Nous vivons pendant quelques jours un événement qui est gravé à jamais dans l'histoire de notre commune. L'anniversaire des 80 ans de la bataille de Saint-Valery-en-Caux. En juin 40, où vos valeureux soldats se sont battus héroïquement à côté de notre infanterie et de nos cavaliers. Nous n'oublierons jamais que 300 de vos frères d'armes ont péri ici. Qu'ils reposent à jamais en paix dans notre cimetière franco-britannique. Nous avons une pensée sincère et profonde pour toute leur famille. Malgré la crise actuelle du Covid-19 et dans le respect des règles sanitaires, comptez sur les Valriquais pour que ce jeudi 11 juin 2020, nous rendions un hommage intense à votre nation écossaise en présence de personnalités de l'ambassade du Royaume-Uni, de Pipers, qui joueront les héros de Saint-Valery. Nous aurons à côté de nous aussi les anciens combattants. Des fleurs et des coquelicots seront déposés en mémoire des vaillants soldats de la 51e Highland Division. Voilà, je vous renouvelle toute mon amitié. Les Valriquaises et les Valriquais pensent à vous, ils n'oublient pas. Demain, l'année prochaine, nous espérons vous retrouver nombreux et tous ensemble pour se souvenir devant ce géant de pierre. Vous êtes et resterez toujours les bienvenus à Saint-Valery-en-Caux, avec toute mon amitié.
The division fought on, and in the early morning of the 12th, part of the French army, under which the division was under command, surrendered. But General Victor Fortune refused, and they fought on. But by 10 o'clock, it was clear that there was nothing that could be done to save the situation, and extremely reluctantly, General Fortune met with Rommel down in St Valery, and the division surrendered. Some 8,000 soldiers of the 51st Highland Division along with many more French, went into captivity. They would spend 5 years in captivity. Some managed to escape, and there are wonderful stories of daring deeds as people managed to work their way through France and down to the Mediterranean to get away. But for many, it was a long, arduous, and very, very rough existence in prisoners of war camp. Today, we have the opportunity, 80 years later, to remember those soldiers and the sacrifice they made to keep us free. There is not a town, village, or hamlet in the whole of the Highlands that doesn't bear the scars of that event, and you can see them on the memorials in every one of those places. It is so important that today we remember the spirit of St Valery and our soldiers, mostly reservists and territorial army, and some regular, ordinary men who did extraordinary things.
He was a lovely man, yeah, and he was really good to his boys. We were his whole world. We spent an immense amount of time in his garden with him. He loved his garden. Coming from a farming background, he was always keen on his veg, and he's passed that on to myself and my wee brother Connell. My grandfather never ever spoke about his war experiences with myself or my brother, and scarcely spoke about them with my father either. I've only really understood his experiences to a point through his recordings, and particularly reflecting on the sound of his voice and looking at the photographs, the few photographs that we do have of him in uniform during wartime, and just being able to pick out some of his emotions and his expressions, both in his face and also in the way that he describes certain things. So oddly enough, it was only really after my grandfather's death that we really came across his poetry in any meaningful way. He, as I say, didn't share a great deal of his experiences with any of us. We were aware of his love for writing. My father often references the fact that my granddad left school at a very young age, as a lot of people did back in those days, to work on the farm to support the family, his mother and father, on the various farms that they lived and worked in Fife. The poetry came to light really through his diaries that he wrote as a POW. That kind of sense of connection with someone when you can pick up something physical. It's not just an oral history, it's physical, it lives, or rather he lives through his writings. Being able to look at his own handwriting and read his words is just so moving. For the first couple of years of being able to read them, I avoided it for the most part. It was so intensely emotional, and being able to get through that was quite a challenge, but something that I'm really pleased I persisted with, to be able to kind of hear his voice again in my head. It was actually quite relaxing these days, you know, someone's thoughts, as he was in his early 20s at the time, I'm in my early 30s now, being able to kind of reflect on just how near apocalyptically challenging some of those scenarios were for him. It's something I can never possibly fully empathise with, but such an insight into somebody's life.
And this poem is called A Poem Without a Title. I've lost a lot of things worthwhile, my pleasures and my fun, and the days of my captivity pass slowly, one by one. But as I sit in loneliness, each day more plain I see, my body may be captive, but my heart and mind are free. Far o'er the wastes of Poland, and Deutschland's field of grain, to woods and fields of northern France, I wander once again. I meet again old comrades, whose laughter oft I've heard, when life was life, and fun was fun, and death was but a word. Their fight is fought, their race is won, they each have proved their worth. Side by side they stood at bay, they now lie 'neath the earth. But though their laughter silence, their eyes no longer shine. I meet them all quite often, for their souls are free like mine. They tell me when I meet them that they're glad I got away. They say, old pal, we know each thing you think and do or say. We know your lot is pretty hard, but take it on the chin. Throw out your chest, hold up your head. For our sake, don't give in. You've hungered more than once with us, been cold and lonely too, but always in those stormy days, our friendship helped us through. Now our strife is over, yours is the hardest test. Alone you represent the gang, so give us of your best. We fought and fell for Britain, and for each other too. We had a stake in Britain, but we've passed it on to you. So if not for yourself, old pal, then for our friendship's sake, be British still and play the game, and play it good and straight. We are gone, but you live on, this coming dawn to see, when peace shall hush a war-torn world, and Britain still be free. Can you take the heritage that we've left for you? If you've not kept our flag unsoiled and played the game all through. So when the going's rough and hard, we know it often is. Just conjure up a spirit of all the boys you used to know. They made the greatest sacrifice, they died in Britain's name, and falling passed the ball to you, so carry on the game.
Yeah, I miss him every single day. He's possibly the most influential person I've ever met in my life, and certainly someone that's left a real kind of legacy in the family of picking up something, whether it's a task, a person, a job, and leaving it in a better state than when you found it. And that's the key thing that he left with all of us.
I suppose anyone hearing these poems might think I'm a sentimental customer, but I think when one had time like us to think of life in general and war and friendship and comradeship and death.
I love you, Grandad.
What incredible words, and remarkable to hear from two generations reading together on such a poignant day. Our sincere thanks go to Jack Lowe Jr. and John Lowe, who you heard earlier. They've worked tirelessly to ensure the bravery and sacrifice of the 51st Highland Division at St Valery is forgotten no more.